Okay. Hi guys, can you see me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, I think I accidentally went to the wrong classroom. I think I went to my cognitive science class and there was still someone in there for some reason. Maybe they just, yeah. Okay, so today I'm going to talk about the introduction to the philosophy of right. And in the class yesterday, I talked about number 1 and number 27. So in number 1, that we have the idea that the science of right has got to do with the idea of right. And an idea is a sort of embodied concept. Yeah, and he's got this idea that concepts are essentially embodied. Yeah, and when we have a kind of an abstract concept, this is just an abstraction from an embodied concept. Yeah, so that we can have an abstract idea of justice, but in order to have an abstract idea of justice, we need an embodied idea of justice. We have the idea of laws as they're embodied in institutions. They're the form of the institutions. They're what gives the institutions right. So an idea is an embodied concept, and the idea of right is the idea of, well, it's going to turn out. He says that the idea of right is freedom. Yeah, so this is what we've got in number 1. And then in number 27, he tells us a bit more about what freedom is. Yeah, so freedom is self-determination. And in 27, he says that the idea of freedom is the idea of the will. So what it is to be a will is to be free. And in 27, he kind of brings this together because he says that the abstract concept of the idea of will in general is the free will which wills the free will. And so we have this idea of freedom as self-determination. And we can think of self-determination as, you know, the will that wills itself. Will So this is I think the big claim of the philosophy of right and of the introduction, that by the idea of right, the German word is recht. It could be translated as law, right, justice. I take it that when he's talking about right, he's really talking about what we might think of as a kind of very broad concept of social normativity. So we live in a social world, and the social world we find ourselves living in is a world suffused with normativity. And this normativity occurs at different levels. You have laws, you know, the public laws of property. This is one expression of normativity. We have private morality. We have our own conceptions of the good, what we should aim at. That's a certain type of normativity. We have the norms that are associated with our ethical life. So there are certain norms that govern my behavior as a father, as a husband, as a teacher, as a citizen. Yeah. So the social world for Hegel is a world that's governed by norms. Yeah. And the philosophy of right really is a kind of an examination for us to come to understand the norms that govern our relations with others. And Hegel's got this project of reconciliation. And the project of reconciliation is to make us feel at home in the modern world. The idea is that the norms that govern our social life, the sort of social norms we find ourselves born into, are the sort of norms that are sort of inherently rational and are norms that we can feel at home with. Wants to make us feel at home in the modern world. So he's got this project of reconciliation. So the idea of right, now what's the relationship between this idea of normativity and will? Well, at one level, we can think of the norms. So the norms that govern our social life are natural, but they're not like tables and chairs. We've got the objects of physics. We've got the objects out there in the natural world. Social norms are not natural objects in that respect. They're the result of human activity. So we can think of the sort of norms, and amongst normativity, social institutions, things like the family, the state, the laws, universities. Yeah, we've got all of these objects in our social world that are basically normative objects that have their existence because of rules, norms, and the like. And by saying that the idea of right, of normativity, is connected to the will, I think at one very simple level, we can think that these institutions exist as a result of human agency. Yeah? These institutions are natural, but they're what Hegel and Aristotle is going to call second nature. They're the result of human agency. And Hegel thinks to be reconciled to the institutions of the modern world is to see them not just as an expression of human agency, but to see them as an expression of human freedom. Yeah. So the norms and the institutions we find in the modern world are an expression of a sort of drive for freedom and self-determination. That's the sort of project. Now, you might think this is an expression of sort of optimistic liberalism, that history has a sort of path to it. Yeah, the path of history is towards something like justice and freedom. And that justice and freedom are going to be a sort of natural result of the resolution of conflicts that arise in the evolution of society. Yeah. So we might think of a kind of, there's going to be, in terms of the evolution of institutions, these institutions are going to arrive as a result of human agency. But we might think there's going to be certain sort of pressures on the way these institutions evolve that is going to mean that these institutions are the expression or somehow conducive to freedom under sort of self-determination in terms of the willing itself. And ultimately, Hegel wants to offer a sort of justification. So in order to be reconciled to the institutions we live in, to be reconciled to something, in something, they need to be justified towards us. And ultimately, Hegel wants to justify these institutions by showing that the institutions, the basic structure of the institutions as we find them in our society, has to do with the way in which they realize this drive for freedom. And this appeal to freedom can then be used to justify the institutions we find in the modern world. The basic sort of institutions Hegel thinks are emerging with modernity. And so we've got a sort of project of justification going on. So he's going to tell us a bit more about the will and about freedom. So starting at number 4 to number 7, we're going to get kind of a very dense little discussion about the will and about freedom and what it is to be free, yeah, and what it is to have a free will. In number 7, we get this idea of what it is to have a will, or to really will something and to will it freely are the same thing for Hegel. So it's not like you have a will and then it can or not be free, but willing itself, properly understood, is free willing. Yeah. So number 4 to 7, we are going to get an account of freedom. Numbers 2 and 3, that's what we're going to look at today. Number 2, section number 2 is going to tell us a little bit about, this is on page 26, it's going to tell us a little bit about his conception of methodology. Yeah, and in particular, he's got a particular kind of understanding of philosophical justification. So why might we talk about justification? Well, the project, as he's told us in the preface, is he wants to offer a kind of, philosophy is, the task of philosophy is reconciliation with the institutions of the modern emerging modern state. And this reconciliation is going to involve a sort of justification. Yeah, we want to show that these institutions are somehow justified. Yeah, and then, well, what do we mean by something being justified? How does a justification work? So number 2 has got to do with, he very briefly making some remarks about justification. And basically, it's basically a footnote that says, read the rest of my work. Read the complete works of Hegel. Yeah, that's basically the justification. Number 3. Involves a rejection of crude, what we might call crude historicism. And I think number 3 is important, because when you read Hegel, I think it's quite easy to think that he himself is offering a form of historicism, that we justify things by understanding their historical origin. Yeah, and in number 3, it makes it quite clear that I think his view is that the historical origin is important in justification, but justification can't just be a matter of historical origin. So what I want to talk about today are number 2 and 3, his understanding of justification in philosophy and his attitude towards historicism. And then next week, we're going to look at numbers 4 to 7. And, well, there it is, yeah. And if that's all we look at next week in Hegel, that's okay. Maybe we'll look at some other stuff later. But if we just get bogged down in numbers 4 to 7, I don't mind. And then after that, we'll look at Mill. And hopefully number 7 has got, we have with the universal, the particular, and then we have the idea of the individual and individuality. And the reason I put Hegel together with Mill is that Mill, also writing a bit later than Hegel, but also very much an expression of 19th century liberalism, is Mill himself offers a defense of individuality. He offers we think of Mill as a utilitarian, but in On Liberty, and even in Utilitarian, he's much more of an Aristotelian. And he basically offers a vision of the modern liberal state as one that promotes and encourages individuality. It allows for the expression of individuality. I think Hegel's conception of modernity is similar in the way it puts individuality at the center. But Mill is, of course, far less German. Mill is messier. He's much more of a pluralist. Whereas I think, yeah, for Hegel, everything's got to be part of a system. Okay, so what about number 2? What is his account of so here's a question for you. You may agree with it. What is his understanding of justification, and What's the sort of position he's rejecting? So it's quite difficult. I think that the clearest thing is in the addition, yeah, where he says, who wants to read? Oh, I'll read it because we're not on Zoom. He says, philosophy forms a circle. It has an initial or immediate point, for it must begin somewhere, a point which is not demonstrated and is not a result. But the starting point of philosophy is immediately relative, for it must appear at another endpoint as a result. Philosophy is a sequence which is not suspended in midair. It does not begin immediately, but is rounded off within itself. What do you think he might mean by this? What sort of view of philosophy is he implicitly rejecting? This is on page 26. Yeah. This is the addition. So this is number 2. And remember, you have the main text, which is Hegel's really official claim written in Hegelese. Then in the addition, he tries to give a translation into something, but it's something he's written. It's like his class lecture notes. So the students have something to look at and say, oh, okay, I get that. And then he's in class and his students are like, Hocam, I didn't understand any of that. And then he kind of goes off on digressions. And what we're seeing in the kind of thing added, the longest bit, these are the written notes of students in his class who have taken down what he says. Yeah, so normally the additions, he goes on digressions, it's much more understandable. He's trying to clarify things for students. So not the addition, the third thing. Yeah, so the addition is the first thing is the official kind of statement using his vocabulary. The addition is supposed to be a bit more informal. And then the class lecture notes are him just kind of speaking off the cuff. So this is page 26, addition. Well, what sort of position is he rejecting here? Yeah?
I don't know if it's kind of perspective. Say that it's more coherentist looking at sort of foundationalist.
Yeah. I mean, I think this is how, in terms of epistemology, this is exactly what I was going to say. That Hegel is rejecting explicitly, one of the central things about Hegel's epistemology right from the beginning is a rejection of epistemic foundationalism. Yeah, both in the theoretical sphere and in the practical sphere. So in the phenomenology, one of the kind of things he starts off rejecting, this idea of sense certainty. We start off with something given in experience, and that's certain, and then we build our knowledge. Yeah, so there's 2 types of foundationalism. You know, in the theoretical sphere, there's a sort of empiricist foundationalism where we start off with what's given to the senses, and that's the foundations. There's a sort of rationalist foundationalism where we start off with knowledge of the self, knowledge of God, the kind of Cartesian foundationalism. And in the phenomenology, it's an attack on foundationalism from the theoretical perspective. But in general, yeah, he rejects foundationalism. And basically what he's defending here is sort of coherentism. That, like, of course, when you do philosophy, you've got to start somewhere. So when we're doing the philosophy of right, I'm just going to start with something as given. The idea of normativity, social normativity. So whenever you're doing a science, you have to start somewhere, and you have to kind of, what you start with, your starting point is something you don't justify. But that doesn't mean it's not in need of justification. It's just that wherever you start, yeah. And then the way in which Hegel thinks ultimately you achieve justification is by understanding how the thing you start with fits into some sort of whole. Yeah. Now, he's starting off, he says, what he's doing here is he's going to start off with the idea of right, of normativity, of law, however we want to think of it, of social normativity. Now, how does this relate to nature? Where does normativity come from? this is something that how do we fit this idea of the social, normative social world together with the scientific natural world? This is something that he deals with in his encyclopedia. So he says, if you want to ask that question, I've got a bunch to say about it, how the idea of right fits together with the idea of the physical world. Yeah, what's the relationship between the normative sphere and the physical nature, between first nature and second nature? Well, that's not the topic of this book. Yeah, go and read my encyclopedia and I've got a story to tell you. So one of my favorite 20th century philosophers is Wilfrid Sellars. And Sellars is a kind of very analytic philosopher. But he has his book, Empiricism and the Philosophy of Mind. In Empiricism and the Philosophy of Mind, he talks about this idea of attacking the myth of the given. The idea that we start with something given, like sense data, that isn't in need of interpretation. And he calls this book Hegelian Meditations. Yeah, and I think he's sort of right, that what we find in Hegel's epistemology is the attack of the idea of the given, that you've got something like the unjustified justifier. Yeah, that you start off with something that's not in need of justification. Yeah, anything within your system can or should be justified. But of course, when you're engaged in stuff, you may take certain things as a starting point. And that's not to say they don't need to be justified. If someone asks you to justify them, there's some story you can tell. But you can't do everything at once. Yeah, so in the philosophy of right, whenever you're engaged in science, you have certain presuppositions. There are certain questions you don't ask. But for this Hegelian position, in some sense, anything can be questioned. Yeah, and then you give it, and it may turn out that your justification ends up being circular. Yeah, because you offer an account of right, and so these sort of, if you're not a foundationalist, you buy into some sort of coherentism, the justification of a certain concept or principle depends upon how it fits together with all your other principles. So that's basically the idea. So philosophy forms a circle, justification forms a circle. You justify things in terms of how they holistically fit together with other things. So justification is a matter and so reconciliation is going to turn out involves this. Reconciliation involves feeling at home in the world, involves understanding how these different things fit together, how your worldview, how your various senses of normativity all fit together to form a sort of coherent whole. And we can come to feel at home in the world and in our normative world by sort of understanding how our normative commitments form a meaningful whole. Yeah, so ultimately, I think that when it comes to this task of reconciliation, that what he's going to offer us is an account of how my understanding of myself as a normative being forms a coherent whole. Yeah, how it all hangs together. This is how Sellars, in his another important work, how was it put to? It says the task of philosophy is to understand how things hang together. Yeah, and this is the Hegelian view. How, and he thinks this is, and Hegel thinks that my self-understanding, my self-conception, ultimately can only really hang together in the modern state. Yeah, because prior to modernity, that there's no coherent way to have a unified self-understanding. This is the sort of picture. So this project of self-understanding and of justification, it turns out that he thinks that it's a project that's only really possible with the emergence of modernity. So that's the first thing in section number 2. Now, he he then oh. Theorem number 2. he then has this kind of chatty thing to students, and we're talking about right, we're talking about normativity, and he looks at 2 approaches to normativity that he thinks are both inadequate. Yeah, so we're going to get this. One of the things that Hegel does is he says, look, here's one thing, here's another thing. They seem like opposites to each other, but each one is sort of inadequate. And then there's this third way of looking at things that is adequate, that does it properly. And his name for doing it properly is, he talks about things like the absolute. Yeah, so an absolute conception is one that is not one-sided. But very often what he'll do in his philosophy is he'll show us 2 approaches and say, here's one approach and here's another approach. And both of these are one-sided. And what we need is an approach that isn't one-sided. And then the problem is that you seem to have these 2 approaches that contradict, that oppose one another. And Hegel says both of these are one-sided. You want a third approach that kind of gives you both of them. And then you're like, I don't really see how I can do that. I don't see how I can combine them. And then Hegel tells you, you're just stupid. Hegel tells you, you're not thinking, you're just using your understanding. Now, you can't understand how they can be combined. You have to learn to think. Yeah, and thinking involves, in some sense, thinking about things that seem contradictory, how you can believe both of them at the same time. And then, yeah, you're like, hold on a minute, I don't get this, I don't understand that. And then Hegel says, no, stop trying to understand. Think, yeah, reason. Yeah, and this is how it works. So we're going to see in these notes that we get these 2 things that are sort of one-sided. So he starts off by talking about the positive science of right. The positive science of right. You'll hear him talking about positive right. What do we mean by any idea? Positive right, positive law? What does this mean? What is the positive science of right? Positive law. Has anyone come across the expression positive law? So, like, going back to natural law theory, people like Aquinas, you have natural law, which is like moral law, and then you have positive law. Positive law is just the law as it actually exists within a state. Yeah. So the positive science of right, this is what you study at law school. So at law school, how do you know what is right? Well, one way of answering this question is you just, hold on a minute, let me go to the law library. Let me have a look at what the legal regulations say. So one way of understanding what is right, and this is the way that sort of jurist understands right, it's just in terms of positive science. That to find out what is right, you need to go to the legal gazette, or you go to the legal codes. Yeah. So the positive science of right, positive right is just the science of what you study at law school. Yeah. What does the law say about this issue? Yeah. Now, this is a perfectly good, like within any society, you need lawyers. And lawyers, in a courtroom, yeah, the lawyers, one of the things a lawyer wants to establish is what does the law say? What does the law say on this issue? And that's a kind of, in some sense, an empirical issue about what the legal system at any particular moment says. Now, the problem with this is the law itself may be wrong. Yeah, so the law itself may be problematic. And so on page 27, yeah, he looks at Roman law. And he says that in Roman law, for example, no definition of human being would be possible, for the slave could not be subsumed under it. Yeah? Indeed, the status of the slave does violence to that concept. So you've got a legal system, for example, the slavery. So merely a sort of, this positive science of right is just the empirical study of a particular legal system. Yeah.
It's main characteristic is constructed. And we see that.
Yeah, so one thing is that Hegel wants to say this is one-sided, but in some sense, the actual laws as they exist in a society really are fundamental to what's right, because these laws are the product of human agency. They're not, these laws are an expression of will. It just turns out in Roman times, they're an expression of immature will in some sense. Yeah, like he talks about the child having risen in itself. So the child has risen in itself, but the child doesn't have risen in and for itself. Yeah, but it only has risen potentially, not actually, and it needs to go through an educational Bildung to really have it. But in some sense, the legal system, say in Roman times, is an expression of will. Yeah, it is an expression of right, but to think this is all there is to right is one-sided. Yeah, I mean, the other sort of alternative, on the one hand, we've got the positive conception of right, and we can have a science of right, which is just we go out there and we can do something like sociology. Yeah, so we could go into a society and do a study of the norms within a community. Once again, if we want to understand what right is, what normativity, what is right? Well, what's right in Turkey? You might think that, you might think there are certain practices that are, I don't know, like honor killings. Yeah, like you might think in certain communities, what's right is to kill your daughter if she's talked to a man. Now, in some sense, if you're looking at the positive science of right, you might think the jurist, but also the anthropologist can go out there and look at the norms, not just the legal norms, but look at the social norms that are kind of followed within a society. In one sense, that's what right is. But this way of thinking about normativity is one-sided. We've got this other way of thinking about normativity. So this way of thinking about normativity and right is one-sided. He says the correctness of the definition is then made to depend on its agreement with prevailing ideas. This method leaves out of account what is alone essential to science with regard to content, the necessity of the thing, this is on page 27, in and for itself, in this case of right, and with regard to the form, the nature of the concept. And in philosophical cognition, on the other hand, the chief concern is the necessity of a concept and the route by which it has become a result in its proof and deduction. So, in some sense, we can look at the norms in a society that can tell us what the norms are. But the philosophical justification, we want something more. We want these norms to be grounded. Now, a very natural way of thinking about how we ground these norms is to say, are these norms sort of compatible with what morality tells us? So another way of thinking about right is to think of that right norms are somehow given to us as facts of consciousness. So this is at the bottom of page 27. He says, hence also the idea of right and its further determinations are taken up and asserted in immediate fashion as facts of consciousness, and our natural or intensified feeling, our own heart and enthusiasm are made the source of right. Yeah, so over here we might think, well, what is objective understanding of norms. What norms are just social facts, things that exist, that we find out there external to us, already existing. And then to understand normativity, we just go and study it empirically, either as a jurist or as an anthropologist. And there's something right about this, that normativity is objective in this way. The second way is what he takes to be subjective, which is the sort of morality of conscience. That we know what's right through facts of consciousness. Aquinas makes a distinction between natural law and positive law. Natural law is the law of morality. And in some sense, Aquinas thinks that this is kind of made by God, the command of God. And the conscience is like this, is like a kind of, God's like a DJ. And we've each got a kind of an antenna, which is our heart, that hears the kind of, the call of God. And this is how conscience is. It's like we're picking up the voice of God inside us. Yeah. And so another way of thinking about right is that we have a capacity just to immediately know what's right and what's wrong. Yeah. The conscience, our heart. And of course, Hegel thinks that this way of thinking about morality has become sort of dominant with the rise of Christianity, with the rise of Protestantism. Yeah, this sort of morality of conscience. In his generation, you had Kant, who kind of pushes the priority of conscience. You have the Romantics, and the language he's using here, like this idea of enthusiasm, is a kind of very negative word. I think in German it's Schwangerei. Yeah, it's like you have these kind of really like religious bigots, yeah, who are filled with religious certainty, yeah, and of course this sort of moral certainty is often expressed. It's the expression of bigotry, of intolerance, etc. So Hegel thinks that this idea that we know what's right, kind of what is right. Well, one view is, well, let's ask people. Let's do an opinion poll. Yeah, we can find out the difference between right and wrong by looking at what people do, or looking at the institutions or the norms of the society. Another view is we can listen to our heart and just say we have some immediate capacity to know what's right. Now, in some sense, it's against this radical subjectivism because of his anti-foundationalism. Yeah, that in terms of knowing what's right, in some sense, we need an interplay between these two things. That our conscience itself is a product of the community in which we live. Yeah, and that to discover what's right, it's going to involve finding something like a reflexive equilibrium. I don't know if anyone's read John Rawls. So John Rawls is quite Hegelian in certain ways. And he thinks that the methodology of sort of ethics involves this search for reflexive equilibrium, where you've got your various commitments, and you've got judgments about particular cases, you've got a bunch of principles you're committed to, and then the way you arrive at justification is to kind of get them to fit into a coherent whole. And I think somehow that Hegel's method is going to be analogous to that, given his sort of anti-foundationalist coherentism. Yeah, but I think he thinks that both of these two approaches are inadequate if we're asking what is right. But both of them have some truth to them. Yeah, so we have to understand what the norms and institutions of our community are. Then we've got to understand our own sort of reactions. Then we've got to kind of find a sort of way of combining them. I take it one thing about this morality of conscience is pushed to the extreme, it's too individualistic. And I think in some sense Kant is much closer to Hegel than Hegel thinks. So I think for Kant, the morality of conscience tells us that what we need to do is we need to interact with others in such a way that we can find some way of living together normatively where we can, you know, and this is going to involve compromising and trying to understand people who are different from us and the like. So that's section number 2. Section number 3 is connected to this. So we might have a view that looks at, a view that looks at the norms. What time is it? Are we running out of time? Okay, so sometimes you can imagine a very conservative person who just says, well, like, why are you going to do that? Well, this is just what one should do. These are the norms of my community. Yeah. So you might have someone who just says, I'm going to kind of follow the norms of my community, and what justifies my action are the norms of my community. And then you say, well, but like, are the norms of your community justified? And so you've got this other question of justification. And you might think that one can justify the norms of one's particular community in terms of their origin. So one can offer a justification of social norms in terms of their historical origin. Yeah. So we've got a form of conservatism. So I think this view, you might think, is the kind of position of the conservatives. This is the sort of radical Rousseauian defender of the French Revolution. Yeah, so conservative radical. We might think that the conservatives can sort of develop their position by saying, well, I'm going to do this because this is what the norms of my society tell me. And then you say, but your society norms are just contingent, they're arbitrary. And you say, no, they're not arbitrary because they've arisen for particular good reasons. If we look at why we have these norms, yeah, this can give us an understanding of this can give us some sort of account of their justification. You know, you could imagine someone, you know, in communities with no, well, think about Khandasam. So if you've got a society with no strong legal code, you might think that in order to keep some sort of social order, that having kind of, if someone steps out of line, you're going to go out there and mess them up. Yeah, and if someone messes with your family, you're going to go and mess with them. And you can see how these sort of norms of can play a certain sort of function in a certain type of social situation. So one might think that one can, in some sense, justify the norms of a society, not by kind of pulling out a picture of an ideal society, but purely in terms of their historical origin. And that, so in number 3, he looks at positive right. He says a bit more. He says, right is in general positive. So a right exists, a kind of positive law, or actual law within a particular community, through its form of having validity within a particular state. So you might think of the question, what is a law? well, what is it that makes something a law? Is it's been, in some sense, there's a bunch of formal things that need to be done in order for something to be a law. Yeah, so you might think that what makes something a law is that it's been voted on in Parliament, signed by the President, and been published in the Legal Gazette. Yeah, so what makes something a law is having the right form. Yeah, there's a procedure that needs to be gone through. Yeah, so he says, right is in general positive through its form of having validity within a particular state, and this legal authority is the principle which underlies knowledge of right, i.e. the positive science of right. So in order to know what the law is in a particular community, you have to know what the rules are that lead to for something to be a law. Yeah, so you have to know, well, in Turkey, something's only a law if it's been published in the official Gazette. Am I right there? I think this is how Turkish law works. There's a certain procedure it needs to go to. And so if you want to know what the laws are in Turkey, there's a certain form that things need to go through that make them laws. And so there is a sort of determinate understanding of what makes something a law in Turkey. So in terms of its form, what makes something a law is it's gone through the right procedure. That's for an official law. You might think norms of a community are going to be different. But there's the science of right in jurisprudence. You might think there's also a study of right in anthropology, and that may be a bit different. But he says, in terms of its content, the right acquires its positive element through the particular national character of a people, its stage in historical development, and the whole context of relations governed by natural necessity. So, why a particular law exists within a community can be understood in terms of the character of the people. Of course, Hegel is a bit racist. You know, you've got these different peoples with different types of personalities. You've got kind of this idea of Oriental despotism, very much coming out of a sort of Hegelian picture. But in terms of history, so we can understand and perhaps justify the content of a law by understanding its historical content. And there was a school of conservative jurisprudence in Germany, in Prussia, in the 1820s, when Hegel was writing, which did just that. So this is how do you spell his name? Savigny, who was a kind of conservative jurisprudence who wanted to sort of justify the law in terms of its historical origin. And how much time have we got? None. So next class online, I'll start off just by looking at page 29 and just looking at Hegel's criticism of this kind of crude historicism. It's a sort of criticism. Last time we were talking about his conservatism. So what we're getting here is a criticism of a certain type of conservatism. Because conservatism, the conservative says you should just, know your place. You know these people, yeah? Know your place. And morality is just a matter of following the norms of your community. And then you might think, well, hold on a minute. Okay, we know what the norms are, but I mean, you might demand justification of these norms. And then Savigny tries to justify the norms in terms of history, that understanding the historical origin of a set of norms or laws is what kind of basically ultimately can provide a sort of justification. And Hegel, of course, is going to reject this, yeah, because he thinks it's not sufficient. It's going to turn out, though, that his account of justification does involve history, yeah, but there's something more substantive to his history, because in some sense we only get historical justification if we think that history itself is justified. And then Hegel, I think, thinks we can think of history as the sort of expression of free will and the emergence of freedom, and that we can look at, yeah. So I've gone over time, but So history alone isn't going to be enough. We need something more. And what's going to play this justificatory role is the idea of freedom. But it's going to play a justificatory role, but it's not going to be, the trick is it's got to play a justificatory role. It's got to be central in some sense, but not foundationalist. Yeah, so it's going to be a kind of, we've got the idea of freedom is central in a certain sense, but it's not foundational. Yeah, because the idea of freedom itself is going to involve coherence. Yeah, that's basically the idea. Okay, so next class we'll start talking about 29. Then we'll get to number 7, and if that's all we do on Hegel, that's quite a lot. But I'll try and say a little bit more about other stuff in Hegel. But I think we get the basic idea of what's going on in Hegel in those. Oops. See you, students.
See you.
Bye-bye. Thank
See
you.
you on. See you next week. And you know there's a storm. Get shopping.
Yeah. Take care.
Yeah. Bye-bye.